Enough is enough, I said to AI. Why don't we talk today about something a bit more down to earth, something that we experienced back in analog times of the late and mid 20th century? The excitements of all this different technology that's allowing us to become much more connected. Today, I wanted to talk about the book that's been out for almost 50 years. The name of it is Changing Places by David Lodge. Honestly, I love British humor, specifically comic books. Before what we are calling comic books or comics actually meant something different. Maybe a right way to call them would be like little humorous novels. And David Lodge is one of the British writers working or who worked in this genre and Changes Places, at least according to Wikipedia, is called the first campus novel, which pretty much says that the whole plot of the book is surrounding the campus, the university. As we could judge just by the cover, something that we normally don't advise to, we see two men, at least on this older version of the book, we see two men who are indeed the main characters. I guess it makes sense. It's reasonably obvious. And pretty much the whole predicament of the plot is already explained in the cover itself. So we see a man in the red blazer smoking a cigar. There is a dark cloud behind him, and there is this lanky tall man with a little bit of a balding hair, really long nose, at least in these illustrations, having a white cloud behind him. And you see they're also facing two different cities are up here, something that reminds us of something more of a British architecture style landscape, and the skyscrapers that we normally would associate with America. And well, indeed, these are two main characters. One of them is American, Maurice Zapp. The other one being Phillip Swallow. Both of them are members of academic staff of their respective universities in the countries where they are hailing from. Phillip Swallow is a British professor, not particularly excited about his work, not particularly excited about his life, living it quite modestly and being quite happy or moderately happy with what he's having. His whole life is really described in really grayish tones, and the only fond memory that he has was this honeymoon with his wife that they spent in a fully made up state in the United States called Euphoria. Phillip Swallow himself with his family are residing in a fictional city in the UK called Rummidge. Which sounds a bit funny. I think Euphoria is much more in your face. Rummidge sounds a bit like, I don't know, rummy, rubbish, I don't know. I guess there is clearly a play of words, like in a lot of those satirical books really are. And the city is not being described as anything being really particularly interesting happening out there. There is a Rummidge University where Phillip Swallow is working. He is on the verge with competing, possibly getting a senior lecturer position at University of Rummidge, and he himself is a member of English faculty. Not particularly bright academic, he is, but by the turn of events, he was sitting on a plane at the very beginning of the book, going back to Euphoria, back to the state where he felt alive in a way, when he felt really, really excited about what was happening to him and what was about to happen. Him already being in his 40s. I think both main characters are aged 40, and both of them are going for this stage in their lives where they are not extremely satisfied with how their lives are happening. So Phillip Swallow's life mainly described probably as sitting in a bog that Rummidge was pretty much described in, as well as his life in there. He living in a pretty regular house. He's getting a really, really modest salary. And him and his wife are contemplating whether they would be able to make changes for the central heating so they wouldn't freeze to death during the winter. On the other spectrum, we have Maurice Zapp, an American professor from the University of Euphoria, Euphoria State. He himself is pretty much more of a superstar in the world of English literature, made his name by analyzing Jane Austen's books, and wasn't actually particularly excited about going to Europe. He is on the brink of getting a divorce with his second wife at this point of time, with whom they have two beautiful twins. And him being extremely dissatisfied with this whole situation, not really wanting to get a divorce, not really being happy with a lot of things circulating, rumors, and particularly not so much of a rumors, that he has been having some potentially sexual intercourses with some of his students. You know, he's been portrayed a bit of a macho man in a way, but more particularly being excellent academic in his field. So he himself found a refuge, going out of this whole bubble that he's been in Euphoria, trying to not necessarily repair his life, but to take a break, going on this particularly weird exchange to Rummidge University, seeing that he's been getting much more money, going to this particular little town in the UK, and not really being interested in going over to Europe. Everybody were really surprised when he decided to commit to this exchange. Of course, David Lodge, the author, is describing both situations in quite detail. I think some of them may be less relevant than the others, but I think it's really important for us to understand the characters for both main protagonists, because pretty much these exchanges, these academic exchanges, changed their lives pretty drastically, I would say. So Phillip Swallow, being a really modest man of really modest manners, without anything particular about him and his character, he kinda got it all loose in Euphoria State. He's been renting a house with some of the older students. At some point of time, he's been like seeing all this little protests happening around the campus, around many different issues, being surprised by the similar things not really happening in Rummidge. And he himself, with his mediocrity, kind of stood out in a way to the American society. With his Britishness and stuff, him becoming a particularly interesting element into the society. Both characters, by the way, were having interesting exchanges on the respective planes that they were taking. So Phillip Swallow ended up meeting one of his older students called Boone, Charles Boone, I believe, who himself, at that point of time, was also studying at Euphoria, more like doing some stuff, becoming some sort of an undercover celebrity in a way on the campus, running an interesting radio show where he pretty much more of a podcast probably to these days, where I guess radio shows used to be like this, when people would be calling in and getting interviewed or just ask questions about. So, you know, that's what Charles Boone at that point of time was doing. Phillip wasn't particularly excited about meeting his old acquaintance, but, you know, still reasonably happy by seeing a familiar face in that plane. On the other hand, Maurice Zapp, the person who was able to also save some costs on his plane ticket that he got from one of his students, selling at a ridiculous discount that he considered at least, he realized that the whole plane was full of women, and as turned out later, all those women were flying to Europe to get an abortion. How ironic that is that 50 years since that book, after Roe versus Wade, when in America all this abortion situation is happening. So I was saying this book contains satire for that point of time for both America and Britain. David Walsh himself being British, book is playing a lot on, like, I suppose, on the stereotypes that Europeans have about America, and of course British love to laugh at Britain. So there has been different turn of events that led to Philip Swallow compromises his principles, getting an affair first with his neighbor at the house that he used to rent. That turned out to be a daughter of Maurice Zapp, with whom he indeed exchanged. And as a matter of fact, later he had a second, more long-term affair. So if the first one was just a one-night stand, free love, university, and all this, something that Philip Swallow by himself wouldn't really able to comprehend. On the other hand, he started to have a pretty more meaningful relationship in a way with still a wife of Maurice Zapp. On the other spectrum, in the UK, Maurice Zapp was also trying to comprehend the academic system of Britain. Was I think, like, a lot of jokes was going around them for both Philip Swallow as well as Maurice Zapp. And sooner or later, all the different interesting and also interesting events aside, Maurice Zapp started to have an affair with wife of Philip Swallow. And even though I didn't necessarily like the book at first, because I think it's using quite a common technique to show and present the characters. Maurice Zapp is presented a bit more in a negative light, while Philip Swallow in positive and neutral. Like, there was nothing special about the guy who was trying to live by his principles, which were like principles of an honest man. And we see how two different societies change them in a way. Like, if we would try to insinuate what the author meant that or not, being in this Euphoria state that was made up state based on California, it corrupted Philip Swallow. It made him to have an affair with several women, even though maybe he wasn't necessarily did this all fully intentional, which is also somewhat weird. And on the other hand, his wife was also extremely upset with this turn of events that pushed her to have an affair with Maurice Zapp, who is being more known for doing good deeds during his time in the UK, where he was helping out this pregnant girl that he met in this plane, where all the women were trying to fly to UK to get an abortion, when he's been helping out a little bit in a way to the family of the person where he was renting out to the O'Sheas, renting out an apartment until he had to move in to Philip Swallow's house for a bit. That later led to an affair. There has been some other interesting things, and I think poking fun at the British educational system, more of a faculty stuff, with Maurice Zapp being an exchange professor, ending up having so much influence and so much credibility that everybody was listening to what he has to say. Similarly to Philip Swallow being a complete outsider, making him one of the leaders of this protest that students has been happening. And it all led to both Swallows and Zapps making an idea to meet halfway through, somewhere around New York, was a funny way of also almost colliding during the eventual meetup that they were about to have in the hotel. And even that meeting was a bit weird. It was like, it's all ended in, Morris Zapp fully switching and taking on the life of Phillip Swallow, but of course adding his own panache to it, while Phillip pretty much was taking on Zapp's family and life, which is, of course, a lot of a bizarre situation. I mean, it's a comic book. It's a humor. It's a satire in a way. And both families found themselves in a really peculiar situation, I must say, which ended up leading them to almost being like swingers. They kind of exchange their partners and then they exchange back to their official partners during that one last meetup that they've been having. And this whole book was written in a quite fine tone, to be honest. At first, I didn't really like it as much, even though it did remind me of one of my favorite writers, British writers, Pelham Granville Woodhouse, who's been writing a lot of humorous books about a lot of different stories, like Galahad and Blendings, for example, and a whole series about kind of an aristocratic layer of the society in the UK, and they're more of a peculiar and fun stories that's been happening to them. The book itself goes in 5 parts, and the story is being told in each of the parts one by one. So first we're talking about one character, then about the other, and then we're switching throughout the whole of the chapters. And then there are 2 particular chapters that are written in a different way. For example, there is the whole chapter called Reading, where it's just exchange of letters, and you pretty much read through all the letters sent by Philip, his wife, and Morris and his wife to each other, exchanging the information and pretty much telling us about the events that has been happening. In the very last chapter, it's already written more in a way of a play, where each of a character, pretty much, you see a little name written next to the line that they were supposed to say, and then there is a little bit of description of what is supposed to be happening on the stage. So it's fun. It's also fun that author himself was poking fun of himself for writing things in such a way. There has been the whole chapter of reading like a newspapers, where we were just reading different little articles from newspapers from both Rummidge and Euphoria. And at the end of the day, it's quite an amusing book to read. And I would just recommend, for those who want to get a little bit of a break from whatever is happening around, to try to distantiate from where we are at in many things in our lives. And some people would like to watch comedies, so maybe you would like to read a comedy book in a way. A fun book that's easy to read, and a lot of things to gag at, and try to make analogies with our nowadays. And surprisingly, 50 years ago, a lot of things kind of stay the same, at least in the attitudes and in the attitudes and the characters of the societies. In many ways, things stayed the same. It probably says a lot about our way of life. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you'll enjoy this book. If you read anything else from David Lodge, or maybe if you want to share your thoughts about this particular book or what I just explained to you, I would gladly hear you down in the comments and read all of them and respond if any of them would provoke an interesting discussion. Other than that, I wish you a very pleasant day.